History tells us the 1943 Ploesti raid was a story of fire and courage. But the official record is hiding a secret. The real story began not in the air, but on the ground with a lie embedded in the landscape itself. A fatal illusion that deceived the mission's best navigators and turned a perfect plan into a slaughter. We've been told the story of the battle at Ploesti. Tonight, we investigate the mystery of the 10 miles of terrain that doomed the mission before a single shot was ever fired. August 1st, 1943. The sky over the Balkans is a shimmering, unforgiving blue. Imagine you're a 23-year-old pilot, crammed into the left-hand seat of a B-24 Liberator. For 9 hours, this rattling, 4-engine beast has been your world. A world that smells of high-octane fuel, hot oil, and the stale sweat of 10 men who know they might be flying to their own funeral. Outside, the heat radiating from the Romanian plains is so intense it makes the air itself seem to warp and twist. You are flying low. Not just low, but suicidally, insanely low. So low you can see the startled faces of farmers in their fields, their heads snapping up as your wingtip almost clips the top of their haystacks. So low your prop wash is whipping the laundry on their clotheslines into a frenzy. This is the entire point. 177 American bombers, flying at treetop level all the way from the dust-choked airfields of Libya, are about to attempt the impossible. The plan, codenamed Operation Tidal Wave, is a masterpiece of military calculus. A beautiful, brutal piece of arithmetic designed in the quiet, sterile briefing rooms thousands of miles away. It's a surgeon's strike. You and the other bombers are the scalpel, intended to slice the heart out of Hitler's war machine, the vast oil refineries of Ploesti. Ploesti is the fuel tank of the Third Reich. It supplies over a third of the oil for every Panzer on the Eastern Front, every Messerschmitt in the sky. To the strategists, it's target number one. A single, decisive blow here, they promised, could shorten the war by months, maybe even a year. The mission depends on two things: absolute precision and absolute surprise. You will fly in under German radar, a tidal wave of aluminum and high explosives, hit your assigned refinery in a perfectly choreographed sequence, and be gone before the defenses even know what hit them. Inside your cockpit, the tension is a physical thing. You can taste it. Your navigator, a kid from Ohio named Miller, keeps checking his charts, his voice a low, steady murmur in your headset, counting down the landmarks. The Danube River. The foothills of the Transylvanian Alps. Everything is perfect. For thousands of miles, across the Mediterranean Sea and over the rugged mountains of Albania and Yugoslavia, the navigation has been flawless. Up ahead, leading your entire formation, is the bomber named Wongo Wongo. It carries the lead navigator for the whole mission, the man whose calculations are the linchpin of this entire audacious gamble. You're just a few minutes from the initial point, the town of Ploesti, where the formation will split, each group turning towards their specific, pre-assigned refinery. White Eagle, Romana Americana, Concordia Vega. The names are like a litany, drilled into your memory for weeks. Miller's voice crackles in your ears. There it is, Targovist. On schedule. Dead on the money. You see the town approaching, a cluster of red-tiled roofs nestled in the green landscape. You grip the yoke, muscles coiled, ready to follow Wongo Wongo for another 12 miles to the critical turn at Ploesti. But then, you see it. An anomaly. A movement so subtle, yet so catastrophically wrong, it doesn't even register at first. The lead bomber, Wongo Wongo, begins to bank. It's a slow, deliberate, confident turn to the right, towards Bucharest, away from Ploesti. A cold spike of adrenaline shoots through you. Your co-pilot leans forward, squinting through the plexiglass. What the hell is he doing? He breathes. On the radio, there's a sudden burst of confused chatter, a dozen voices overlapping in disbelief. This isn't a slight correction. This is the wrong town. It's the wrong turn. The entire plan, the beautiful, perfect arithmetic of the mission, has just been thrown into a garbage can. In the sky around you, a wave of indecision ripples through the formation. Some pilots instinctively follow their leader. Others hesitate, their massive bombers wobbling in the air as their crews scream at each other over the intercom. The scalpel has just broken, miles from the target. And you are flying directly, blindly, into the teeth of what was considered the most heavily defended target in all of Europe, second only to Berlin itself. The element of surprise is gone. The plan is dead. And in that moment, suspended 50 feet above a Romanian field, every man and every bomber is gripped by the same, silent, terrifying question in a mission planned with a surgeon's precision. How could the very leaders of the operation get it so catastrophically wrong? Back in the stifling heat of the Benghazi command tent, the official explanation began to form even before the last of the crippled bombers had limped home. War, especially aerial war, is a game of probabilities and acceptable losses. The men who planned Operation Tidal Wave were not naive, they were masters of a cold and brutal calculus. They knew that in any operation involving hundreds of men and machines, flying thousands of miles over hostile territory, things would go wrong. This is what military planners call friction. It's the gremlin in the machine, the unpredictable human element that can jam the gears of the most perfect plan. And when the first fragmented reports of the premature turn at Targovist started filtering through, friction was the immediate, logical, and deeply comforting diagnosis. The official story, as it began to crystallize on the briefing boards, was one of singular, tragic human error. The lead navigator aboard Wongo Wongo, First Lieutenant Brian Flavel, a man handpicked for his skill, must have made a mistake. Under the immense pressure of leading the largest bombing raid in history, staring at a landscape that refused to perfectly match the maps drawn in London, he simply misidentified one Romanian town for another. A fatal, but understandable, blunder. Colonel Keith K. Kane, the group commander flying alongside him in Wongo Wongo, trusted his navigator and confirmed the turn. It was a single point of failure. A terrible misfortune, yes, but a contained one. The plan itself, the logic of the low-level surprise attack, remained sound. The fault lay not with the blueprint, but with one man's hand faltering as he drew the line. This explanation was clean. It was logical. It allowed the architects of the mission to maintain faith in their strategy. But then, the survivors began to talk. Not just the pilots and navigators, but the gunners, the bombardiers, the men who had stared death in the face from 50 feet above the ground. And their stories, told in hushed, trembling voices in smoke-filled debriefing tents, were not clean. They were a chaotic, contradictory mess that refused to fit into the neat box of human error. An intelligence officer, trying to build a coherent timeline, would ask a pilot from the 98th Bomb Group, "So you followed the lead element?" And the pilot, his eyes hollowed out and still seeing the fire, would shake his head. "No, sir. We knew it was wrong. Our navigator, he was screaming we were turning too soon. We broke off. Try to get back on course." Imagine the intelligence officer's confusion. This isn't a single error anymore. This is dissent. This is a mutiny in the sky. He turns to another crew, this one from the 376th, the lead group. "And you, Captain? You followed Colonel Kane?" The captain nods grimly. "We follow our leader. That's the rule. But the radio god, the radio. It was supposed to be silent, but it was chaos. Men yelling to turn, others yelling to follow." The official report stated the mission maintained radio silence until the attack. But here was the ground truth, a reality of screaming, panicked voices tearing the plan apart from the inside, miles before a single bomb had fallen. The contradiction wasn't just the turn itself, but the reaction to it. The plan called for a single, unified fist to smash Ploesti. A synchronized assault. Think of it like a symphony orchestra. The mission was written for every instrument, every bomb group to come in at the exact right moment, creating a single, devastating chord of destruction. But the premature turn was like the lead violin suddenly deciding to play a different song in the middle of a performance. The result wasn't just a sour note, it was the utter collapse of the entire symphony. The formations shattered. Some groups followed the wrong turn, got lost, and ended up approaching Ploesti from the southwest, the direction the Germans expected them least and therefore defended the most. Other groups, like Colonel John R. Killer Kane's 98th, broke away and tried to find the correct route, arriving over the target alone, minutes later, to find the defenses fully alerted and waiting for them. The single, overwhelming tidal wave had disintegrated into a series of scattered, isolated, and suicidal platoon-sized charges against a fortress that was now wide awake and furious. The comfortable explanation of a single man's mistake was evaporating in the face of a far more terrifying truth. A simple navigational error could not, and should not, have caused a complete breakdown of command, cohesion, and the fundamental principles of the attack. The tidy, official story was a lie. The real story, buried in the traumatic accounts of the survivors, pointed not to a single point of failure, but to a catastrophic systemic disease that had infected the entire mission before it even reached the target. To understand why this premature turn was not just a mistake, but a death sentence, you have to understand the sheer, bloody-minded arrogance of the plan itself. Operation Tidal Wave wasn't just another bombing mission. It was a declaration of war against the fundamental laws of aerial combat. In 1943, the established doctrine for strategic bombing was simple: fly high, fly in tight formation, and let the combined defensive firepower of 1,000 machine guns protect you. You dropped your bombs from 25,000 feet, a distant, impersonal altitude where the ground was just a map and the enemy was a puff of black smoke. But Tidal Wave threw that entire rulebook into a bonfire. The planners and Allied High Command had a problem. The Ploesti refineries weren't just buildings, they were complex, sprawling industrial organisms. Hitting a specific cracking tower or pumping station from 5 miles up was like trying to perform brain surgery with a sledgehammer. You might destroy the city, but you'd miss the vital organs. The only way to guarantee the kill was to get low. So low that your bombardiers could look their targets in the eye. So low that the flak cannons on the rooftops would be firing down at you. This is where the real stakes of the mission come into focus. The strategy was built on a single, fragile pillar: the element of surprise. Let's do a quick war college briefing on this. Imagine you're planning to rob the world's most secure bank. The bank has guards, vaults, and alarms, a layered defense. Kicking in the front door in broad daylight is suicide. But what if you found a secret tunnel that led you directly into the vault, bypassing every security measure? That was the theory behind the low-level approach. The German air defense network around Ploesti was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. It had radar, hundreds of heavy anti-aircraft guns, the deadly 88s, and 105s, all networked and centrally controlled. It had fighter squadrons on standby, but it was all designed to look up. It was a system built to detect and engage bombers at high altitude. The plan for Tidal Wave was to fly underneath that entire system. A fleet of 177 heavy bombers would become a ghost on the radar, a terrifying ground-hugging monster that would suddenly appear over the horizon, already inside the perimeter, too low and too fast for the heavy guns to track. The success of this entire multi-million-dollar, 1,000-man gamble rested on one critical 10-mile stretch of Romanian railroad track between the towns of Târgoviște and Ploesti. At Ploesti, and only at Ploesti, the formations were to make their final, perfectly timed turns onto their attack headings. This choreography was everything. It ensured that the different bomb groups, each with a different refinery to hit, would strike their targets almost simultaneously from multiple directions. This would overwhelm the defenses. It would create so much chaos, so much smoke and fire in so many places at once, that the German gun crews wouldn't know where to shoot. The defenders would be paralyzed by the sheer, shocking audacity of the assault. The premature turn at Târgoviște didn't just bend this plan, it shattered it into a million pieces. By turning early, the lead element wasn't just flying to the wrong place, they were ringing the doorbell of the bank they were trying to rob. They were announcing their presence to the entire German defense network. Every minute they flew in the wrong direction was another 60 seconds the German commanders had to scramble their fighters, to alert their gun crews, to turn their formidable defensive system from a sleeping giant into a wide-awake, enraged beast. The secret tunnel was gone. Now, the surviving bombers, scattered and disorganized, had no choice but to charge the front door, one by one, in broad daylight, into a hurricane of steel that was now pointing right at them. The mystery was no longer an academic question for after-action reports. It was a matter of life and death that was unfolding in real time. The men in Benghazi could only listen to the horrifying silence on the long-range radio, knowing that hundreds of their friends were flying into a meticulously prepared meat grinder. The investigation had to begin, not to assign blame for the dead, but to save the living. They had to know, and know immediately, was this a simple mistake under pressure? Or was it something worse, a fundamental breakdown in the very chain of command designed to prevent it? The hunt for the truth had officially begun, born from the smoke and flames rising over the plains of Romania. In the sweltering aftermath, The airbase at Benghazi became a library of trauma. Intelligence officers, their khaki uniforms stained with sweat, moved through makeshift debriefing rooms, trying to assemble the shattered mosaic of the mission. The process was agonizing. They were asking men who had just watched their friends burn to death in fields of sunflowers to recall precise timings, compass headings, and radio frequencies. The initial reports were a storm of conflicting accounts, colored by grief and the ringing echoes of machine gun fire. But amidst the chaos, one name kept surfacing as the anchor for the entire disaster: First Lieutenant Brian Flavel, the lead navigator aboard Wongo Wongo. It was the simplest, most logical explanation. One man, one mistake, one tragic outcome. But one intelligence officer, a methodical captain named Elias Thorne, couldn't let it go. He was an investigator at heart, a man who believed that history, like a crime, always left behind evidence. He sat in his tent late into the night, long after the others had collapsed into their cots, staring at the mission manifest under the weak glow of a single bulb. He wasn't looking at the casualty lists. He was looking at the crew assignments, specifically for the lead elements. And that's where he found it. The first clue. The plan had a failsafe. The architects of Tidal Wave were not fools. They knew that placing the navigational fate of nearly 200 bombers in the hands of one man was an unacceptable risk. So, they had appointed 2 lead navigators. Flavel in Wongo Wongo was one. The second was Captain William Wright, flying in the lead plane of the 93rd Bomb Group, a B-24 named Hell's Wench, piloted by the legendary Colonel Addison Baker. The 2 planes were meant to fly side by side, a 2-headed navigational brain for the entire formation. They were supposed to be a check on each other, a system of redundancy designed to prevent the very thing that had just happened. Thorne felt a jolt of intellectual excitement, the first flicker of hope in a day defined by despair. The official story of a single, isolated error had a fatal flaw. For it to be true, both of the mission's best navigators had to have made the exact same mistake at the exact same time. The odds were astronomically against it. He started pulling the debriefing transcripts, not from the shattered remnants of the lead 376th group, but from the survivors of the 93rd, the men who flew with Colonel Baker and Captain Wright. He sifted through pages of harrowing accounts of the attack itself, his eyes scanning for any mention of the minutes before the turn. And then he found it. A transcript from a young co-pilot who had been flying off the right wing of Hell's Wench. The man's testimony was brief, his voice on the wire recording still shaky. "We saw Wongo start to bank," he said. "Colonel Baker, he didn't follow. Not right away. Our navigator, Captain Wright, he was adamant. He was screaming on the intercom that it was the wrong landmark. Absolutely certain." Thorne leaned forward, his heart pounding. This was it. The failsafe had worked. Captain Wright had correctly identified the landmark. He knew the turn was wrong. He read the next line, and the air went out of the tent. Colonel Baker pulled Hell's Wench up, slightly out of formation. The co-pilot continued. He broke radio silence, trying to raise Colonel Kane. "We saw him firing flares. He was trying to get his attention, telling him to correct his course. It was obvious we were protesting. We were refusing the turn. The mystery had just been supercharged. This was no longer a story about a navigator's quiet, tragic error. This was a story about a public, desperate, high-stakes disagreement played out at 200 miles per hour, 50 feet off the deck, in full view of the entire bomber stream. The system's alarm bell had been ringing loud and clear. Captain Wright had seen the cliff's edge and was screaming a warning. But Colonel Keith Kane, the overall mission commander flying Wongo Wongo, had heard that warning and ignored it. He had deliberately steered the entire formation over the edge anyway. For the first time, Thorne and the other investigators had a solid piece of evidence. A new path forward. The sense of optimism in the command tent was palpable. They had a new lead, a new question that promised to unlock the entire puzzle. The focus shifted entirely away from the navigator, Brian Flavel. The new investigation, the real investigation, now had a single, burning question at its center: why would a commander, when faced with a direct, public warning from his own expert co-leader that he was leading his men into disaster, choose to fly on? The revelation that Colonel Kane had been warned, that he had actively ignored the protests from Hell's Wench, felt like a key turning in a lock. The investigators in Benghazi thought they were on the verge of a breakthrough. The most logical theory was simple: a catastrophic breakdown in command. Perhaps Kane, an experienced but famously stubborn leader, had developed a case of get-there-itis, a pilot's fatalistic tunnel vision where reaching the target becomes more important than reaching it correctly. Maybe his pride wouldn't let him admit a mistake in front of hundreds of his men. The investigators dove into this new line of inquiry with renewed vigor, certain they would find a story of human failing, of a commander who broke under pressure. They began interviewing every surviving member of the lead 376th Bomb Group, the men who had flown with Kane. What they found plunged them back into a deeper, more profound darkness. The lead they had been so certain of turned out to be a dead end, a false trail that only led to more confusion. The crew of Wongo Wongo, or what was left of them, painted a picture not of a reckless commander, but of a confident one. According to the co-pilot, there was no panic on the flight deck when Hell's winch broke formation and fired flares. There was no screaming debate over the intercom. Colonel Kane had remained calm, resolute. He simply saw the town of Targovist, conferred with his navigator Flavel, and ordered the turn as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He wasn't gripped by doubt. He was certain he was right. He was following his orders. He was executing the plan. This discovery was maddening. The investigation had hit a wall of human certainty. Two expert commanders, Baker and Kane, had looked at the exact same piece of Romanian landscape and had come to two completely opposite conclusions, both willing to bet the lives of 1,700 men on their decision. The focus of Thorne's investigation had to shift again. If the flaw wasn't in the men, then maybe it was in the information they were given. He and his team locked themselves away with the one piece of evidence that existed before the chaos: the maps. They spent days poring over the reconnaissance photos and the navigational charts issued to the crews, comparing them with the written descriptions of the approach. And slowly, a new, more insidious enemy began to emerge. It wasn't a German general or a flawed American colonel. It was the land itself, and the lies it told from 50 feet in the air. The mission planners, working from high-altitude photographs, had identified the initial point, Ploesti, by its distinct Y-shaped railway junction and its proximity to a specific bend in the Prahova River. But as Thorne's team studied the terrain leading up to it, they found the flaw in their own blueprint. The town of Targovist, 12 miles early, also sat near a river bend. It also had a railway line. From the cockpit of a bomber flying at over 200 miles per hour, with the sun in your eyes and the entire German army waiting for you, the two landmarks were dangerously, seductively similar. It was a fatal Rorschach test. The landscape was an ambiguous ink blot, and each command crew saw what their stressed, overloaded minds were primed to see. Flavel and Kane, leading the charge, saw the first potential match and, in their eagerness to stay on a brutally tight schedule, convinced themselves it was the right one. Wright and Baker, flying alongside, saw the same picture but spotted the subtle inconsistencies. The angle of the tracks was slightly off. The shape of the town wasn't a perfect match. They held back, trusting their gut and their more cautious reading of the map. The lie on the map wasn't a deception drawn by the Germans. It was an ambiguity in the terrain that the mission plan had failed to account for. The hope of finding a single, simple answer collapsed into dust. This was a story of compounding failures. The ambiguous landmark was the first domino. The second was the breakdown in the one system that could have corrected the error communication. Thorne's team re-examined the radio logs and debriefing transcripts. Colonel Baker had indeed broken the strict radio silence, frantically trying to warn Kane. But in the chaos, with dozens of other crews also starting to chatter in confusion on the same frequency, his warning may have been lost in the static. The flares he fired were a desperate, last-ditch visual signal, but in the bright Balkan sun, against a sky filled with nearly 200 other aircraft, they may have gone unnoticed or been misinterpreted. The perfect, intricate machine of the mission plan had a fatal design flaw. It had created a system of navigational redundancy to leaders, but it had failed to create a clear protocol for what to do if those two leaders disagreed. There was no tiebreaker. The entire plan rested on the assumption that both men would see the same thing at the same time. When they didn't, the system didn't just bend, it shattered. The investigation was no longer about finding a villain. It was about confronting a terrifying truth that even the best plans, executed by the bravest men, can be utterly destroyed by a fatal combination of bad luck, ambiguous information, and the simple, tragic failure of two human beings to communicate across a few hundred yards of empty air. The discovery that the disaster was not a single error but a cascade of systemic failures was a body blow to the investigation. It was a more complex and far more damning conclusion. A single navigator's mistake could be written off as the cost of war. A fundamental flaw in planning, command structure, and communication protocols implicated everyone, all the way up the chain. Captain Thorne and his small, exhausted team gathered in their tent, the mission charts and contradictory testimonies laid out on the map table like the components of a bomb. The air was thick with the one thought that no one yet dared to say aloud. To grasp the weight of this moment, you need to understand the sanctity of an operational plan. A battle plan is more than a set of instructions, it is an article of faith. It's the product of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of hours of work by the best minds available. To suggest that the plan itself was flawed, that its command structure was brittle, is not just a critique, it is a form of heresy. It implies that the system itself, not just the men within it, is fallible. Thorne felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He and his team had followed the evidence, piece by painstaking piece, from the cockpit of Wongo Wongo to the ambiguous geography of the Romanian plains. And the trail had led them here, to a conclusion so monstrous it felt like a betrayal of the very institution they served. The tragedy of Ploesti was not an act of God or a stroke of enemy genius. It was a self-inflicted wound, born of overconfidence in a rigid plan and a failure to prepare for the one thing war always guarantees: human fallibility. Their duty as investigators was to report their findings, to present this ugly, inconvenient truth to their superiors. But they knew what would happen. This wasn't a truth that high command would welcome. It contradicted the clean, simple narrative of heroic sacrifice in the face of unpredictable enemy action. It was messy. It was embarrassing. It suggested that hundreds of men had died not just because the enemy was strong, but because their own leaders had sent them into battle with a flawed weapon. They were no longer just solving a mystery, they were about to become whistleblowers, holding a truth that the system itself was designed to reject. Captain Thorne typed the final line of his report, the paper curling slightly in the humid Libyan air. The document was a masterpiece of cold, irrefutable logic. It laid out the evidence step by step, the dual navigator failsafe that created a command paradox, the photographic analysis of the ambiguous landmarks, the breakdown of radio communication at the critical moment, and the lack of contingency planning for a leadership disagreement. The conclusion was unavoidable and stated in the clipped, professional language of a military communique: the catastrophic navigational error was not the result of a single point of failure, but a systemic breakdown rooted in inadequate topographical analysis and an inflexible command structure unable to resolve real-time leadership disputes. It was the most diplomatic way of saying, our plan was a house of cards, and the first gust of wind blew it over. He submitted the report to 9th Air Force Headquarters in Cairo. He expected questions, arguments, perhaps even a summons to present his findings in person. He received only silence. For 3 days, the investigators in Benghazi heard nothing. The silence was more unnerving than any angry cable could have been. It was the sound of a vast, bureaucratic machine grinding to a halt, unsure of how to process a piece of information that threatened its very foundations. The system, faced with an uncomfortable truth, was beginning to push back. The response, when it finally came, was not a request for clarification. It was an order. A telex arrived, crisp and impersonal. Captain Thorne and his entire investigative team were to be immediately reassigned. Thorne himself was being transferred to a supply depot in Khartoum, a logistical black hole in the middle of the desert, as far from strategic analysis as one could get. The other members of his team were scattered to the winds, sent to different units across the Mediterranean theater. Their investigation was officially terminated. The final, overarching report on Operation Tidal Wave, the one that would go into the official histories, would be compiled by a committee in Cairo. There was no court-martial, no formal reprimand. It was a quieter, more insidious form of execution. They were being buried. Their report, with its terrifying implications, was classified top secret, a designation that ensured it would be locked in a vault and never see the light of day. The official narrative was already being cemented, chiseled into the granite of history. Tidal Wave was to be remembered as a story of incredible heroism in the face of overwhelming odds. A story of brave men flying through a wall of fire, of 5 medals of honor awarded posthumously, including one for Colonel Baker, who died leading his squadron to the correct target. It was a story of valor, not of a fatal, systemic failure. To introduce the element of a flawed plan would be to tarnish that legacy, to suggest the sacrifice had been not just tragic, but preventable. For Thorne, this was a profound moral crisis. He had spent his entire career believing in the system, in the chain of command, in the idea that truth, no matter how ugly, was essential to winning the war. Now, that very system was telling him to be quiet. It was choosing a comforting lie over a devastating truth. He was given a direct order to pack his bags and forget what he had found. The conflict was no longer with the Germans, it was with his own side. The battle to uncover the truth of what happened at Ploesti had been lost, defeated not by enemy fire, but by a single, dismissive telex from headquarters. The ghost in the machine had won. This is the part of the story where the official histories fall silent. For Captain Thorne, the transfer to Khartoum was a form of exile. He spent the rest of the war counting crates and managing shipping manifests, his brilliant analytical mind slowly suffocating under the weight of mundane logistics. The explosive report he had written, the product of so much painstaking work and intellectual courage, was gone, swallowed by the archives. He became a ghost in his own story, a man who had glimpsed the terrifying truth behind the curtain and been punished for it. He had done his duty, and his reward was obscurity. The system had protected itself. Back on the front lines, the war moved on. The surviving crews of the Ploesti raid were patched up, given new bombers, and sent back into the sky to fight and die over Italy and Germany. The official narrative held firm. Tidal Wave. Despite its horrific losses, 53 aircraft destroyed, 660 airmen killed or captured, was a story of a tragic but unavoidable navigational error compounded by unexpectedly fierce defenses. The inconvenient questions about the command disagreement and the plan's inherent flaws were quietly forgotten. The tragic, avoidable disaster that Thorne and his team had tried to prevent was now irrevocably set in motion, not just in the past, but in the future. Because the lie had consequences. The crushing weight of this moment isn't just about the injustice done to one intelligence officer. It's about what happened next. By refusing to acknowledge the true, systemic cause of the disaster, Allied High Command learned the wrong lesson. They attributed the failure to the tactic itself, the low-level approach, rather than to the flawed command and control that underpinned it. The diagnosis was wrong, and therefore, the cure would be fatal. Imagine a doctor who sees a patient die from a reaction to a specific drug, but, for fear of admitting a mistake, blames the patient's underlying disease. The doctor then stops using that drug for all patients, even those who might be saved by it, and instead prescribes a less effective, more dangerous alternative. This was the state of Allied air strategy over the Balkans. Over the next 6 months, the memory of Ploesti would shape every major decision, but it was a memory built on a lie. The ghost that had haunted Operation Tidal Wave was still at large, whispering flawed wisdom into the ears of generals, and Allied airmen would pay the price for that ignorance in blood. The lowest point of this story isn't the fiery crash of AB-24 in a Romanian field, it is the quiet, bureaucratic decision in a Cairo office that allowed the same kind of tragedy to repeat itself over and over again. The catastrophe of Ploesti, as it was understood in 1943, was one of fire and steel. But the true, unfolding catastrophe was one of silence and ink. With Thorne's report buried, the official explanation for the disaster solidified. The low-level daylight raid was deemed inherently flawed, a tactic too costly to repeat. The losses were attributed to the sheer density of the flak and the unfortunate navigational error. This became the accepted wisdom, the lesson learned. And because of this flawed lesson, the tragedy of Tidal Wave didn't just end in August 1943, it echoed forward, shaping the very strategy of the air war. Let's watch this consequence unfold, not from a command tent, but from the cockpit of another B-24, 6 months later, in the winter of 1944. You are a new pilot, fresh from the States, assigned to the 15th Air Force in Italy. You've heard the stories of Ploesti. They are told like ghost stories in the mess halls, cautionary tales of what not to do. The lesson you have been taught is simple: stay high. The disastrous low-level experiment is over. Your new orders are to attack Ploesti again and again and again. But this time, you will do it from 25,000 feet, the safe altitude. From this height, the refineries are just small gray squares on a vast, snow-dusted map. Your bombardier stares through his Norden bomb sight, a complex mechanical computer designed for precision. But at this altitude, in the whipping jet stream, it's more like a guessing game. You are part of a massive formation, 1,000 bombers this time, a brute force approach to a problem that was once meant for a scalpel. You drop your bombs and turn for home, seeing only distant puffs of smoke. You feel disconnected, safe. But the Germans on the ground are not disconnected. They have learned their own lessons. And because the Allies have abandoned the element of surprise offered by the low-level approach, the Germans can now concentrate all of their formidable defenses, their radar, their fighter squadrons, their thousands of heavy flak guns on a single, predictable high-altitude threat. They have turned the sky above Ploesti into a permanent, stationary kill box, 5 miles high. For the next 4 months, the 15th Air Force hurls itself against this wall of steel. The perspective of the ignored warning becomes brutally clear. Every mission is a bloodbath. Formations are savaged by swarms of Me-109s and FW-190s that are vectored to the perfect interception point. The flak is so thick, so accurate, that veterans swear you could get out and walk on it. The losses are staggering, dwarfing even the single-day horror of Tidal Wave. The campaign to destroy Ploesti from high altitude will ultimately cost the Allies over 350 more bombers and more than 3,000 additional airmen. They are dying in droves, trying to solve a problem with brute force that was created by a single, unacknowledged systemic failure. The historical irony is devastating. The very strategy adopted to avoid another tidal wave was, in fact, creating a slower, more agonizing version of the exact same slaughter, all because the true lesson of that disastrous day had been deliberately and systematically buried. The key that finally unlocked the full context of Ploesti wasn't found in a single dusty archive in Washington or London. It emerged over decades as historians pieced together records from both sides of the war. They studied the German defensive preparations, the Allied planning documents, and the personal diaries of the men who were there. Jump forward 30 years. Imagine an old man sitting in a quiet university office. He is hunched over a newly published historical journal, his reading glasses perched on his nose. The man is Elias Thorne, now a respected professor of military history. The life he might have had as a top-level strategist was traded away for a career in academia, a quiet punishment for being right too soon. The article in front of him is a detailed post-war analysis of Operation Tidal Wave, written by a new generation of historians with access to once classified files. And as he reads, the ghosts of 1943 rise up around him. The analysis confirms every point of his buried report. It details the topographical ambiguity of the Romanian landscape. It reconstructs the command disagreement between Kane and Baker. It highlights the fatal lack of a contingency plan. But it adds another layer of tragic irony. Declassified intelligence from Allied codebreakers revealed that while the Germans didn't create a grand deception to cause the wrong turn, their own intelligence was superb. They knew, through radio intercepts and other sources, that a massive raid was forming. They didn't know the exact route or tactic, but they were on high alert. So when the bombers appeared, scattered and disorganized after the turn, they were flying into defenses that were already primed and waiting. The internal failure of the plan had delivered them, piecemeal, to an enemy that was already looking to the sky. Thorne leans back in his chair, the chill that began in a Benghazi tent 3 decades earlier finally settling in his bones. His report, the one that had ended his career, had been right. The systemic failure was real. The decision to bury that truth had not only been an injustice, it had been a strategic blunder of epic proportions, costing thousands of lives in the high-altitude campaign that followed. The system had not just pushed back against the truth, it had chosen institutional comfort over the lives of its own men. So now, let's step back into the quiet of this archive room. The fog of war over Ploesti has finally lifted, and the picture that emerges is one of beautiful, terrible clarity. Every bizarre clue, every contradiction, every heroic sacrifice now aligns. The premature turn wasn't a malicious deception or a single error, it was a perfect storm of ambiguous terrain, human fallibility under pressure, and a brittle command structure. The fierce disagreement in the sky between Colonel Kane and Colonel Baker wasn't about pride, it was a tragic, real-time battle between two dutiful commanders, each convinced they were right, with no mechanism to resolve their conflict. The catastrophic losses weren't just the price of a daring tactic, they were the direct result of a flawed plan delivering its own men into the teeth of an alert enemy. The best analogy for Operation Tidal Wave is not a military one. It's that of a Swiss watch. The mission was designed to be a marvel of intricate, interlocking parts. Hundreds of gears, bombers, crews, navigators, commanders, all calibrated to turn in perfect harmony to strike at a precise second. But the watchmakers had overlooked a fatal flaw in the design. Under the immense pressure of combat, two of the most critical gears, the two lead commanders, ground against each other. And in that single, frozen moment of friction, the entire, delicate mechanism tore itself apart, showering the plains of Romania with its own broken pieces. This new understanding reframes the very nature of heroism and sacrifice. The men who flew that day, especially those like Colonel Baker and Hells, who defied the wrong turn and charged headlong toward the correct, but now fully alerted, targets, were not just brave. Their courage becomes something more profound. They were men who saw the plan disintegrating around them, who knew the symphony had devolved into chaos, and yet chose to fly on and play their part anyway. They flew on because that was their duty. They flew on for the men beside them. They weren't just fighting the Germans that day, they were fighting against the collapse of their own mission, trying to salvage purpose from a plan that had already failed them. And that is the enduring echo of Ploesti. It stands as one of history's most brutal reminders of the collision between the perfect plan on paper and the chaotic, human reality of combat. But more than that, it is a testament to the fact that the most dangerous flaws are often not in our enemies, but in ourselves, in our plans, in our systems, and in our unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The story of that fiery August day is not just about a bombing run gone wrong. It is an eternal investigation into the price of inflexibility and a tribute to the men who are forced to pay it.